Hi, I'm Louis Meyers, and welcome to this edition of Meet the Author, where we talk about books with the authors who wrote them. And I am so pleased and honored today to have with us Miss Karen Tumulty of the Washington Post, who is a longtime political reporter and now opinion writer for the Post, who will be talking with us today about this tremendous book she's written called The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. It is obviously about the former First Lady, Miss Nancy Reagan, but about so much more, about her times and about, of course, the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Just to introduce Miss Tumulty, she was born and raised in Texas. She graduated from the University of Texas, where she got her start in journalism. She would later go on to get an MBA from Harvard University. She worked 14 years with the Los Angeles Times as one of their national reporters and won national awards while there. From 1994 to 2010, she was with Time magazine, where she was their White House and congressional correspondent. She then went on to the Washington Post from 2010 to 2021, where she again was the White House correspondent and political reporter. She also served as the deputy editorial page editor and currently writes a weekly column in the Washington Post in the opinion section. And I am so pleased to have you here, Miss Karen Tumulty.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I am so grateful for your interest in my book.
Well, I think it's an important book. And I would start, as I do with many authors, about asking the origin story of this book, because when I read the acknowledgments, this was a major work. It took, I think, 4.5 years, perhaps not full time, but certainly much of your time. You had to leave your home in Washington to go out to California for weeks at a time at the Reagan Library to do the primary research. So it was a major, major effort. What made you decide to write this book about Nancy Reagan? How did that start?
Well, interestingly enough, it was not my idea. Simon & Schuster, Nancy Reagan, this was 2016. Nancy Reagan had just died. And the top editor for nonfiction at Simon & Schuster is also a former editor of mine from Time magazine. And over the years, she had come up with various book ideas, and nothing sort of felt right. So we get to the late summer, early fall of 2016, and she says, "What about Nancy Reagan?" And I thought, I'm such a great political analyst, mind you, that remember, this was 2016, that I thought, Hillary Clinton's presidency is going to be so conventional. I really need an outside project. So I really walked into this with no preconceptions, no book proposal, and really no very clear idea of how you go about writing a book.
And were there any major surprises, just in terms of the writing process itself? What did you learn about yourself and about writing?
Well, it was interesting because what was interesting to me was that there was so much that had already been written about Ronald Reagan. There were a number of books that had already come out about Nancy Reagan. They tended to either fall in the gossipy, snarky category or the worshipful fashionista category. And I really did spend about a year sort of floundering around and thinking, what the heck have I gotten myself into here? And then one night when I happened to be, having yet another attack of insomnia, I was reading one of Lou Cannon's amazing, huge biographies of Reagan. And I came across this quote, many hundreds of pages in, that said, "Reagan knew where he wanted to go, but she had a better sense of what he needed to do to get there." And I went, oh my goodness, this is my North Star. This is what this book needs to be about. And it's funny because I later talked to Lou Cannon. He didn't remember writing that line, but it really gave me the frame. And I just started interviewing a lot of people who had been there, who had known her. Uh, where it was, I opened the book with something that George Shultz, the former Secretary of State, 97 at the time I interviewed him, had told me about. And it was also sort of a bit of a trust building exercise all along because the guardians of the Reagan legacy are very fierce. And so it really, it oftentimes would take me 2 or 3 interviews to sort of convince people to kind of open up to me with these stories, that I was going at this as just a truly journalistic enterprise. And then as I was getting deeper and deeper into it, whether it was talking to people who were there or going through these incredible records at the Reagan Library, or the oral histories, or the many, many books that Reagan insiders had written, I realized that this was not just a story about Nancy Reagan, that really, if you did not know their relationship and understand how really unique it was, you didn't really have the full story of the entire Reagan era.
And I think that comes through the book, every chapter, every page, about that this was truly a power couple in a different way than perhaps some of the other first ladies have been. Let's just talk about Nancy Reagan first before we get into her relationship with Ronald Reagan, because she starts her early part of her life, by your account, it was very formative, as it is for many of us, but it's one which was difficult. Can you talk a little bit about her early years?
Sure. Nancy Reagan was the product of a broken marriage, a marriage that was really pretty much already over by the time she showed up, between an ambitious actress and a man who came, I'm sorry, between an ambitious actress and a man who came from sort of faded, uh, New England aristocracy that had, the money was long gone and he was sort of failing at one career after another. The two of them had split. The marriage was over by the time she was born. And before Nancy was out of diapers, her mother essentially left her with relatives, abandoned her, so that she could pursue her own acting career. And so Nancy is sort of, her formative experience is this anxiety, and that would really never leave her throughout her life. Now, her mother ultimately finds love again, marries a very prominent Chicago neurosurgeon, comes and retrieves her daughter, who becomes very attached to her stepfather. And Loyal Davis, a pioneering neurosurgeon in Chicago. He was the second most important man in her life. And it's that essentially redeems her childhood. But again, she is never left without the anxiety that even when things are going well, you just never know when the bottom is going to fall out.
And that is a motif that is there throughout the book and throughout her life, as you describe. Her parents, the Loyal Davis and her mother, that's an interesting marriage, because her mother was a character, to say the least, and Loyal Davis was something of a buttoned-down neurosurgeon who was well respected but not necessarily well liked, but yet there's a certain warmth there that gives her some stability. She goes off to Smith College in Northampton, Mass., where she's sort of an average student. It's just to go forward a little bit. She gets involved in theater, and then some B movies out in Hollywood. Sort of an average actress, not going to be a star. But Hollywood is a part of her life already before she even meets Ronald Reagan, right? There are through her mother, these movie stars, Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, Clark Gable, and others, in and out of her household. So she is not unfamiliar with Hollywood.
Yes, and she uses her mother's connections to, wangle a screen test at MGM that is overseen by family friend Spencer Tracy, who's probably at that, in the around 1947, 48, maybe the most bankable star in Hollywood. So she does get a contract at the premiere of the big Hollywood studios. And I did go back and watch a number of her old movies. I mean, she was not the sort of glam. Elizabeth Taylor was at the studio then. She wasn't that kind of Hollywood star, but she was I thought a pretty good actress, very subtle, and her skill often was just sort of the way she was able to sort of subtly react to the people she was acting with.
Well, and we'll get to that later, but she certainly has a sense of empathy and communication that serves her well throughout her life.
That is sort of the other side of the anxiety, is she developed just an incredibly keen radar about people, about situations, and something that, and we'll talk about this later, that Ronald Reagan actually often lacked.
Right. So she meets Ronald Reagan, and this is where Ronald Reagan comes into the book. You've spent the first part of the book talking about her upbringing, but then you begin talking about Ronald Reagan and what's going on with him around the time he meets Nancy Davis.
His life has hit bottom. He had come to Hollywood, I think, in 1937, had never really made it out of the B movies. World War II comes along. He's kind of sidelined, and he's starting to get a little bit old, and so his career is not taking off. Meanwhile, his first marriage to Jane Wyman, she's just won the Academy Award for Best Actress. Her career is taking off. His is hitting bottom. She walks out of the marriage, and then, as circumstances would have it, when Ronald Reagan meets Nancy Davis for a sort of blind date, but the fact is she had him on her own radar for a while and been trying to arrange this. He shows up on crutches because his leg has been broken in multiple places in a celebrity baseball game. So his marriage is gone, his career is going away. He is quite literally a broken man. And he would later say, "And along came Nancy Davis and saved my soul."
And we know from other sources, Lou Cannon and others, about Ronald Reagan's own childhood, which was difficult. He also, I believe, had an alcoholic father and had a difficult upbringing. So they each come to this relationship with some wounds from the past. But they meet and ultimately marry.
There are some ups and downs,
There
by
are some
the way,
ups and downs in their relationship prior to that.
In the dating relationship, because he was, there was always a little bit of kind of distance with him.
This is a period of time where he begins to go around the country speaking as a representative of General Electric, which provides him some sizable income finally, and also gives him experience along with his previous acting in terms of public speaking. He's gone for weeks at a time giving these speeches. And then he also goes through a political transformation. Can you talk about that briefly?
Sure. So he is the host of a show called General Electric Theater. And it was a very big television show at the time. But part of the deal was he traveled the country as sort of an ambassador for General Electric, literally, walking the floors of General Electric factories all over the country. And there is the place that Ronald Reagan would be. Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, was a Democrat for most of his early life, a worshiper of FDR, which he always was, but he begins to meet some of the people who would later become known as the Reagan Democrats. And he begins to sort of understand and relate to these people in middle America and their frustrations. And his own political philosophy is also moving to the right, in part because he was an ardent anti-communist at a time when, of course, the Red Scare was racking Hollywood. He, from his own experience, becomes, taxes in those days for high-income people were basically confiscatory. So he's got some of these sort of embryonic political ideas, but his ability to connect those ideas to the stories of people, that is really built as he is traveling the country for General Electric.
This is where his legend of being the great communicator perhaps begins.
Yes.
He also becomes...
But again, as much as he was a great communicator and could really relate to people on a big scale, he was actually not very close to people individually. There was a kind of remoteness to his nature that, again, I think we see with a lot of adult children of alcoholics. And, as I write in the book, he was close to exactly one person in the world, and he married her.
And you get that from talking to people who had worked closely, his chief aides who had been with him for decades, who never really felt that there was the real human connection as much as they might have wanted from him. He becomes president of the Screen Actors Guild, and then in 1964 campaigns or endorses Barry Goldwater in an important speech. And then some of the wealthy Republicans in California begin to court him to run for governor of California. Of course, he had no formal political experience, and he was running for an important post. What was Nancy Reagan's thoughts about him going into politics?
Well, I mean, she would always say, if he had gone into selling shoes, I'd have been there in the store with him. I mean, she was going to do what he wanted to do. But both of them were very leery of this. I mean, they both had some skills that they had honed in Hollywood, but and she, I think in particular, was very naive. When she gets to Sacramento as first lady, it really, she's not very happy there to start out with, but it really takes her a while to sort of understand and accept kind of the realities that come if you have a life in politics. I mean, yeah, there's a spotlight, but it's a lot harsher than the spotlight in Hollywood.
This is where her reputation for being sort of gilded, wealthy, etc. person starts, I think, because she gets to Sacramento, which is perhaps what Albany is to New York City, somewhat backward culturally, and the governor's mansion is run down fire trap basically, and she will have none of it, and she wants to move to a different setting for the governor's residence and puts a lot of money into that, and she begins to get a reputation in California as being a sort of a big spender. But I think you have a more sympathetic view of that.
Yeah, I do. I think though that she was learning, and she understood her husband's nature, and that he tended to be trusting of the people around him. He tended to assume that if they talked a good game, that they were with it, his agenda, they were going to follow through, which wasn't always the case. And also that he had a tendency to delegate. And she did very early on understand that this was a man who, for all of his political instincts, for all of the goodness of his nature, was really going to need somebody to watch his back. And his first political consultant, who recently died, his name was Stu Spencer. I spent many, many hours with him.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a very early political consultant who really, he and his partner took a flyer on this washed up movie actor who thought he could run for governor. But he told me that he went out to lunch early on as he was trying to figure out if he even wanted to take this race on. And Reagan's agent told him, you are going to have to find somebody who can fire people because Ronnie is not capable of it. And Stu told me that she became personnel officer in chief for Reagan.
And not always obviously appreciated by some of the people around him. Let me ask you, divert for a minute. You mentioned Ronnie. You do use his first name, Ronnie, as his wife did, but throughout the book, even when you're talking about him more objectively, was that I assume that was a conscious decision not to call him Reagan or whatever, to call him
Yeah,
Ronnie?
there were so many people in the book named Reagan that I finally decided that I would use the, intimacy of how she referred to him, which was as Ronnie. I've got to tell you though, as I was going through the library, one of the things that is in the personal files are all the love letters he would send her.
They're
She
beautiful
saved
letters.
every little scrap of paper. She saved every little card on a floral arrangement that he would send her. And he had all these little pet names for her. The most amusing of which I think was Mommy Poo Pants.
Well, yeah, that would be that would probably didn't get out publicly until
Right.
later. When you speak of all these Reagans, indeed there were other Reagans. There were four children, two I believe from his previous marriage to Jane Wyman, and two that they had. Is that correct? And
That is correct.
and you
Yes.
spend a fair amount of time looking at these parental-child relationships because they were struggled, a lot of them, with the exception maybe of Ron Jr. But the others, it was difficult. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The two children from his marriage to Jane Wyman were Maureen, the daughter they had together, Michael, a son they adopted, and there was a third child, Christine, a baby who only lived for a few hours. And it was really the stress of losing that child, I think, that contributed to the collapse of the marriage. But so what happens is then those two children are sort of left on their own. I mean, Jane Wyman becomes kind of an absentee mother, and Reagan, they are never sort of incorporated into the Ronald and Nancy Reagan family. Then Reagan and Nancy Davis, go on to have two biological children of their own. She was actually pregnant with Patty when they got married. And Ron, he's not a junior, but Ron Ron comes along later. And again, and you would even Ron and Patty even made references to this at Nancy Reagan's funeral in their eulogies. I mean, the bond between Ronald and Nancy Reagan was so close that it excluded everybody else, including in many ways their own children. And they do become a pretty dysfunctional family with each of the four children kind of left to sort of go off and find their own way.
It's not an unsympathetic portrait, though, of Nancy Reagan as a step parent and as a parent, because it sounds like she tried, given her own insecurities and her own upbringing, that she tried to be a step parent, tried to be a parent, often unsuccessfully.
You know, she wrote in her own memoir a line that really stuck with me. She said, "All I ever wanted to be was a good wife and mother, and I guess I succeeded more at one than the other."
Mm-hmm.
And her dedication on that book is also a little heartrending. She dedicates her book to Ronnie, who always understood, and to my children, who I hope will understand someday.
Right. And I think to some extent they did, or at least several of them did have. So just to cut forward a little bit, of course, Ronald Reagan challenges Gerald Ford in 1976. It becomes governor, serves 2 terms in a difficult time in California in the United States history in the 1960s, challenges Gerald Ford in 1976, almost unseats an incumbent, and then, of course, in 1980 runs and wins a fairly substantial victory against Jimmy Carter. So now he's in the White House, and one of the first things that happens, only 2 months after he's in the White House, is, of course, he comes within moments of dying. And my alma mater is George Washington University Medical Center. I will give a shout out to them for having saved him. But he almost dies in the assassination attempt. And this absolutely throws Nancy Reagan for a prolonged state.
This, as I said, she spends her life with this idea that no matter how well things are going, there's always a trap door. And everything could vanish. And Reagan was much closer to death than the White House let on at the time. But she saw it. And she was a surgeon's daughter. So she understood, I mean, as she's witnessing this at GW, how close he is to death. And she's already protective. I mean, and I have incidents during the 1980 campaign where she pulls together the rescue effort of the campaign at a time when it looked like it could be going under.
Yeah,
but those protective instincts are heightened by this.
Well, it's heartrending. During that, when he's been shot and he's going to GW and they're backed up in traffic or car, she said, "I'll get out and run the rest of the way." She's like 6 blocks away.
They tried to convince her not to go. Yeah. First they come to her own Secret Service detail chief comes to her. She's at the White House, and Reagan is up Connecticut Avenue giving a speech. And he says, "You need to know there's been a shooting, but the president is fine." And actually, when Reagan gets shoved into the car, speeding off after the shooting, they think he is uninjured. And all of a sudden, he starts coughing up copious amounts of blood. And his own secrets, thought they were bringing him back to the White House, but it was his own Secret Service chief who says, "Get him to an emergency room." Reagan walks into the GW emergency room on his own 2 feet. And as soon as he gets in there, his knees buckle. And they think maybe it's a heart attack. It takes a while before a nurse finally notices this tiny sliver of a wound, and they know there's a bullet in there, and they can't find the bullet.
The
So anyway, Nancy Reagan is told he's fine, but he's at GW. Why? And she's like, well, why did he go to the hospital? And she's in a total panic, and they're saying, just wait here. He'll be home soon. And she says, I'm not waiting. And they try to talk her out of it. And she says, if you don't get me a car right now, I'm walking.
Well, I think, and then she gets to see him, and probably that was, I'm sure it was a huge help for him to see her at that moment. Now, one of the things that comes from this, which people may remember, is she had already been involved with an astrologer named, I can't remember the name of the astrologer, but at any rate, this then becomes a central part of her daily existence, working with this astrologer in terms, and when it becomes public, there's a big brouhaha.
Yeah, there's a little bit more background in all of this. Astrology was kind of popular. I mean, first of all, show business is a very sort of superstitious occupation. So there was a kind of in the 40s and 50s, astrology was really popular among people in Hollywood. People would sign their contracts according to this date or that date. Um, Reagan and Jane Wyman would go to astrology parties. But after the assassination attempt, um, Reagan has a deeply rooted religious belief. He believes that God saved him, and God saved him because he had a purpose. And this, what I later, among other things, animate his efforts to end the Cold War. Nancy Reagan, whose stepfather was an atheist, who really was not raised in a religious tradition, is looking for anything that can sort of give her a feeling like she's got control, because she is convinced that every time her husband leaves the White House, there is somebody else out there waiting to finish the job for
And it
John
probably
Hinckley.
was. I mean, that's...
And so she latches on to this astrologer in California, a woman she, I think, only met, I don't know how many times, hardly at all in person, named Joan Quigley. And so she starts having like weekly phone calls with her. And this is, think of how dangerous this is, where she is like sharing the president's schedule with this stranger in California who is telling her, like, this date's good, this date's not. And they would do really strange things, like decide that Air Force One on a foreign trip would have to take off at 2 in the morning, and they would give the
drove the
press some
staff
goofy
crazy. I think there's
story
some...
about how, oh, well, that's all about jet lag, when in fact it was because this astrologer had timed it. And this was all a very big secret for a long time in the White House. It was managed by her closest aide, Michael Deaver. And I did not really find any evidence that, like, Joan Quigley, though she would later claim, was like calling the shots on policies. But she was mucking around with the schedule quite a bit.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I don't know that we've ever, perhaps in former presidencies, something like that had occurred, but you may be the first to talk about it. But it did drive her aides crazy a little bit.
The few who knew about it, and people would get really mad at Deaver because they thought that he was like throwing up and rearranging the schedule because he was just disorganized. And they did not know that all of this was coming from an astrologer in California via the First Lady.
There are so much more we can talk about. I mean, she obviously had run-ins with a certain number of high-level staff, most particularly Don Reagan, who was Treasury Secretary and then Chief of Staff, who she essentially forced out, probably a good thing. But I think more important was some of the influence she had on President Reagan around certain issues that he was struggling with, AIDS being one of them. Obviously, also the nuclear disarmament and the détente with the Russians. Those were, for example, talk a little bit briefly about each of those issues. How did she affect his? AIDS was beginning to, be identified during his presidency, and he did not even mention the word AIDS for a number of years. But Nancy Reagan, behind the scenes, had a different mindset.
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on this, and I found out really a lot of things that had never been reported before. And really, the early years of the AIDS epidemic, I think that I just think Ronald Reagan's handling of AIDS is going to stand out as one of the deepest scars on his legacy. But it was really Nancy who begins, again, daughter of a physician, begins to sort of understand this. And so the president he did not say the word AIDS until his second term. But when he is finally going to give his first big speech on the subject, she gets involved very aggressively. She comes in, gets her own speechwriter. She does not want the White House Communications Office, which at the time was being run by Pat Buchanan, to be in charge of this. And going through these speech writing files where the Reagan's aides are having these arguments about what can be in the speech and what can not be in the speech. Finally, Landon Parvin, the outside speechwriter that she has recruited, decides to bring in Everett Koop, the Surgeon General, who had never talked to the president about AIDS before that, tries to disabuse him and some of his more conservative staffers they wanted him to, not suggest it was possible to get AIDS in a swimming pool. At that point, William F. Buckley, the great conservative, leader of the time, had written a column saying people with AIDS should be tattooed. People who have HIV should be tattooed on their arm if they're a drug addict, and on their buttocks if they're if they're gay. And so the speech is not perfect, but I was able to find how many things didn't get into the speech because they're all in the files in the White House. And Landon Parvin told me that he would win arguments by just saying, this is how the First Lady wants it.
Those words spoke multitudes to Ronald Reagan. We're going to have to skip past the nuclear disarmament and détente, although I would encourage people to read the book because I laughed out loud at some of her interactions with Reza Gorbachev, they were each trying to upstage each other at different times, perhaps Gorbachev more than, perhaps even more. Let me finish with one thing in particular. Let's just talk about first ladies and perhaps someday first gentlemen. It's a difficult position. Obviously, the electorate has elected their spouse, and yet the First Lady has a staff of her own and has something of a bully pulpit. We have seen a whole variety in the last 50 years of different ways First Ladies approach this. Obviously, Hillary Clinton made things somewhat difficult by becoming so involved early on in President Clinton's presidency with the health reform issue, trying to actually set policy. Rosalind Carter was a strong First Lady with issues of her own, Betty Ford, Laura Bush, and others. And then there are others. Melania Trump appears to really value her privacy, and it seems like we rarely see her in the public eye. How do you see the office from this book and the research you've done, how do you view the office of the first spouse or first gentleman, first lady?
Well, I tell you, all of these women, and so far they've all been women, I mean, they come into this, it's not a job, it's a role. And there is no job description. And each of them is left to sort of figure it out on her own. And it is in part based on the moment in history in which they find themselves. It is based on their own interests, but it is also really, really based on their relationship with the person they married and how well they understand both the strengths and the weaknesses and the ambitions of this person. And so you really have seen a lot of different models of how to do this. There isn't a right model. There have been a few wrong models, but each of these women has had to sort of figure it out for herself.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and I'll put you on. You can defer if so choose. But knowing what you know of Nancy Davis Reagan and her husband Ronald Reagan, what would their thoughts be right now about the current situation in the White House? What do you think their thoughts would be?
You know, Nancy Reagan hated this question because after Ronald Reagan descends into Alzheimer's and it really becomes left to her to shape his legacy, she would really get angry when Republicans would say, well, this is what Ronald Reagan would think. And, Michael Reagan, his son, still says that. So in respect for her, I'm not going to guess this. I mean, it's very clear that a lot of the policies that Donald Trump is following are the exact opposite of what Reagan did. I mean, he passed the biggest immigration reform in decades and offered amnesty to millions of people who were in this country illegally. He was a huge free trader. But and also there was I mean, from my view, a real grace to the way in which he related to the country. But I'm not, I don't think people who have sort of tried to hijack his name for their own purposes were a real sore spot with Nancy Reagan.
Well, I want to hold this up again if the camera is on me, and if it's not, there we go. This is a wonderful book. It did come out in 2021. It is so current. It is so worth reading to understand where we've been in the last 40 years. And about this, it really is a love story. It's not just a political story. This is a love story, and it's a terrific love story. And I thank you for writing it and for being with us today.
Well, thank you so much. I so appreciate being here.
Thank you.